Welcome to this webinar on expectation gaps and the hidden cause of stress, conflict, and burnout. And while that title may sound a little bit intimidating or vague, maybe, if you're here today, you've probably had the challenge with setting clear expectations or receiving clear expectations for yourself. You've either set them or provided what feels like clear expectations. You've been given a deadline or given a deadline, and you've explained something, and somehow things go sideways. Somehow there's misalignment, deadlines don't get hit, priorities get confused, and it leads to a lot of frustration, blame, or even self-doubt. Did I not explain it clearly? Why aren't they following through? Why aren't I being recognized for what I've accomplished? What's wrong here? And the truth is, it's not that we're really bad at communicating. It's not that people don't care about the work that they're doing. The problem is that our world has changed, but the way we set expectations hasn't. Now, for years, I've talked about how expectations are really a foundational component to strong performance. That if you don't have that clarity, if you don't understand what it is you're supposed to do, how it is you're supposed to do it, and where you're going, you're never going to get there successfully together. And I want you to think about this kind of like going on a journey, which is why I've got kind of this group of people that are just about to embark on a journey up a mountain. And I use the mountain analogy a lot when we think about peak performance. But I want you to think about going on a journey, and that when it comes to expectations, we have to figure out how we're going to work together to get where we want to go. And the expectations are what are going to help us be able to do that successfully. Now, there's a lot of challenges that get in the way of us successfully getting to where we want to go. When it comes to this journey, the challenge is that we have to keep ourselves aligned together and moving in the same direction so we don't waste energy by trying to pull or move in different directions. And when it comes to expectations, there's all these different challenges that come up. So, for example, there's unclear or unspoken expectations. People often think that they've communicated clearly, but then there's a lack of understanding in what was heard, and people remember and interpret those communications differently. There's also constantly changing priorities. Things are shifting too fast for people to keep up. There's mismatch between expectations and people's capacity, whether people have the ability and the capacity to actually execute successfully on the expectations that are set. There's fear and pressure that can distort the expectation. So if we are viewing our expectations through a fear of judgment, a fear of disappointing others, or even a fear of losing our jobs, it can lead to people over promising or people pleasing and hiding their struggles or their challenges. There are issues with lack of follow through and accountability where we commit to things, but people don't actually follow through or complete the things that they've committed to, which leads to a lot of frustration. There's also emotional dysregulation that interferes with our emotions. Depending upon the level of stress and strain we're under, it impacts the state in which our body is operating and how we interpret our experiences and respond to the challenges in our environment. And then there's generational and cultural differences. So depending upon how we interpret and how we grew up and how we experienced in our lives, it impacts how we view different types of communications and their effectiveness and their overall impact. And despite there being a lot of these different challenges, and probably each one of these could be focused on individually to address how to navigate and mitigate against those challenges, there is an underlying challenge that really exacerbates all of them. And we have to understand how the human body responds to expectations before we can really look at a better approach that produces better performance outcomes around expectation setting. So what's really important here to recognize and to acknowledge is that we've been trying to set expectations in environments that are flooded with constant change, uncertainty, fear, and overwhelm. They've always been hard, but now it's even harder. We've got a lot of workplace and market volatility. Just this week, we're seeing markets change pretty dramatically. There's a lot of economic instability. Organizations are going through layoffs. are still recovering the human experience through the pandemic and the effects of what that did to people's nervous systems and the tolerance that people have for stress. We're still having to come back from. And there's a lot of AI disruption and technology that's impacting how people work and the ways in which people work. And so, underneath all of our conversations about goals and deliverables and what we're supposed to accomplish, there is this underlying stress, emotion, and survival responses that shape how expectations are heard, held, and acted on. And if we don't understand that hidden system, if we don't account for the human realities underneath the surface, then no matter how clear or smart we make our expectations, they're going to keep slipping through the cracks. So today I want to show you why the old ways of expectation settings aren't working anymore and look at a new approach that's not just rooted in how do we communicate or how do we write goals in a particular way, but in how humans actually function under stress, pressure, and complexity. Because when we can work with our human systems, with our bodies instead of against them, setting and meeting expectations doesn't just become possible, but it becomes a really powerful tool for promoting peak performance. So before we can talk about the solution, I have to get into just a little bit of neuroscience. And I always do this kind of primer to give you the basics so you understand how the human body is really wired. And it's important to note that our bodies are wired to survive, not to thrive. At its core, our human body's primary objective is to keep us alive, to help us survive. And there's two things that it does that it focuses us on to do that. The first is to ensure that we have sufficient resources. So these are things like food, shelter, and companionship. So if you think about when a baby is born, it needs food to survive. It needs care to survive. Human babies cannot survive on their own. And so a baby will cry so that it can get its needs met, so that it can get fed, so that it can get connection and shelter and care from its caregiver. And we know from studies that when babies are deprived of that connection, when they cry and their needs are not met, it leads to long-term developmental challenges and impacts on how the baby responds in different environments. So our bodies are wired to conserve energy, so reduce the amount of change that's happening so that we can have sufficient energy, food, etc., to navigate the world and to survive in the world. Secondly, it's to avoid predators and threats to safety. So our bodies are wired to look for what might cause us pain, what might be a threat to us. And when it experiences a threat or when it experiences a painful challenge or experience, then it creates a pattern. It creates a pathway for how to respond in similar experiences in the future to then further promote our ability to stay alive. The more we can rely on those patterns, the more that the quicker and easier we can respond to the challenges in our environment. So how does this work? Well, we have these neurons in our body, and neurons are responsible for telling our body what to do, everything, sending messages. As I move my hands, it's sending messages for how to move my hands. At the same time, there are messages telling my heart to beat, my lungs to breathe, my gut to digest my food. All of the things that we do, conscious and unconscious, are messages being sent in our body through by neurons through neural pathways, through connections. And these connections form throughout our lives based upon our experiences in our environment. So as we grow from that baby, we have different experiences and we exist in different environments, and they create our ways of being, our ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving. How do we think about things? How do we feel about things? How do we take action or behave in the world is shaped by the collective of all of those experiences and environments, creating those neural pathways within us. And on a larger scale, this expands to when we come together into families or communities or workplaces, the ways in which we work and live, the way that we get things done, the way that we execute, decisions get made, we think about things, the way problems get solved, the way that we communicate, connect, and relate to one another. All of this is part of our collective ways of being. So the ways in which we think, feel, and behave then shape the ways in which we work and live. And so when we have these experiences, when we have these neural pathways and these neural connections throughout our bodies, it can create reactions in the body based upon those survival pathways. And we call these different survival responses. So maybe you've experienced people or you're currently experiencing people, and if you are, you can throw one in the chat if you want to. You don't have to, but maybe you're experiencing people in your organization who are arguing about expectations, pushing back on deadlines or deliverables. They blame others for the lack of clarity. Maybe they're over explaining or over defending. Maybe they're avoiding conversations, ghosting on deadlines, taking over too many tasks, procrastinating, or even overcomplicating the work. Maybe they feel paralyzed about what to do first. They shut down emotionally. They go silent in meetings. Maybe they're nodding yes, but actually no actions really being taken. They maybe even appear apathetic. Or maybe they immediately say yes to everything. They overpromise, they mask when they're struggling, they try to rescue other people, and they're just constantly seeking approval. If you or people in your organization are experiencing these are examples of fight, flight, freeze, and fawn states. And these are automatic survival responses in our body that come into play based on our past patterns to help protect us from the challenges that we're experiencing. So when our body feels threatened, or when our body feels a potential risk of against our survival, and maybe not actual survival, but a risk of enduring pain or a challenging experience, it can shift into one of these states. And a way to think about how our body operates is this kind of dial. So I want you to look at like that circle on the left side as like a dial. And where we want to be is at the top. But oftentimes we find ourselves at the bottom. And based upon our experiences and the states that we're in, we find ourselves in these different states. And so if we start at the bottom left, there's the fight flight state. So this is if we're anxious, tense, angry, maybe hopeless, panicked, stressed, despair, we may find ourselves in a fight flight response. On the other side, we may find ourselves in a freeze fawn response where we're shut down, where we're numb, where we're drained. These are other examples of where we might find ourselves in this survival state. But where we really want to be is at the top. We want to be in a balanced and in a coherent state. And when our brains are wired to detect uncertainty as a threat, it can't predict what it is that we need. And so our brains will shift into these states in order to help us survive them. And when they do this, it impacts how we think. We can't think as clearly. We can't plan or prioritize as well. We don't always hear or remember what people say. And so they're really hijacking how our brain is thinking and what our brain is doing and what's necessary to meet the expectations that we're setting effectively. What happens over time as we experience these different survival states and as we are shifted into these is that the stress in our body begins to build up. And each time we have a stressful experience that we don't discharge the stress from, that we don't fully recover from that stressful experience by bringing ourselves back to our original baseline, that stress builds in the body. And you can see on that chart how when we have these experiences and the stress builds, it almost becomes like we're carrying around boulders of stress in the body. And so unlike in the past times when you would outrun a predator and you would literally be running away from the predator and discharging the stress of that experience by running, in today's world, we're sitting behind computer screens and we're not discharging the stress. We're not moving it out of our body. And so that stress builds and builds and builds. And what that does over time is it makes us more sensitive to perceived threats. So our tolerance for responding to challenging situations becomes less. So situations where maybe we wouldn't have reacted in a certain way, or we wouldn't have experienced an extreme emotional reaction to them, we're more likely to do so under this excess stress. If you think about it, after you've had a good vacation or a nice recovering weekend on Monday, when something bad happens or somebody says something that might be considered critical, you are more likely to respond with giving them the benefit of the doubt or calmly. But if you get to the end of the day or even the end of the week, when you've been dealing with a lot of stressful things, when the week has been hard and challenging, and maybe your kids are screaming or yelling, and now somebody's critical or somebody sends an email that is somehow critical or offensive, we're much more likely to be sensitive to or perceive that as a threat. So stress isn't really just living in our heads, it's building up in our bodies layer by layer. And as it does so, it creates this tension and it changes how we perceive and interpret the experiences around us and makes us more likely to see things as threats. And so it's important to note that expectations is not just about communication, which is what we often talk about. It's really about navigation. Expectations are really the shared understandings we create about what actions, outcomes, or ways of being are needed to achieve a desired purpose. They're not just demands or tasks, they are agreements that align thinking, emotion, and action towards a goal or target. The truth is that in order to navigate all of the human beingness of our humans and all of our ways of being, thinking, feeling, and behaving, and these different stress states and survival patterns that develop within us, we have to understand the map to navigate our relationships and our interactions in that context. And we have to recognize that all of that is going to shape how we perceive success, belonging, meaning, how we interpret whether expectations are cleared, whether we're connected to them, whether we're motivated and mobilized to take action on them, and whether we have the capacity to even achieve them in the first place. So when those same expectations are unclear, misaligned, or interpreted through that survival state of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, then they become threats, burdens, or triggers that lead to breakdown in trust, motivation, and action. A way to kind of understand this is to think about what happens when we communicate. When we communicate, it starts by going through our head brain. And I talk about that there's neural networks in our head, heart, and our gut. And those networks each perform specific functions. So when we're communicating around expectations or really anything, our head is first perceiving it through our senses. It's taking in the information, then it's trying to understand it and make sense of it. What does this mean? How does this fit? How does this apply or connect to the goals of the organization? What is it that I'm hearing and what is it that I'm perceiving? Then our heart relates to the person. Do I trust this person? What is my understanding of this person's intent or meaning? Do I have questions about, why they're saying what they're saying? How do I feel about this? How am I feeling? How is the other person feeling? And what's really important, or what do I view as truly important about what we're communicating or what I'm hearing? And then our guts are digesting everything, literally and figuratively. Our guts are taking in all the information, not just what is said, but all of the subtle and unconscious communications. And it's assessing our safety risk or our self-preservation. Are we safe in this? Is there a risk to us? Is this something that we need to have a survival state be activated? And then our guts are determining what actions, what are we going to mobilize into to take action. So let's look at when we're having these experiences, or let's look at kind of an analogy of what happens and how we respond when we're faced with these challenges. So if we go back to that journey, we're going to climb a mountain with a group. Imagine for a moment that you've been climbing a mountain together. The path is clear, the goals agreed upon, but overnight there's a massive storm that rips through, destroys the trail, and another storm is on its way. There's a lot of pressure, fears building, and there's this sense of urgency and panic that's coming. Just imagine that and notice in your body if you experience any types of responses. What happens is people begin to shift into varying states of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. So maybe they start thinking, I have to take control to survive. So they go into fight mode. They start blaming other people. How did we get here? Whose fault is it? Why did we decide to go on this trip? They start arguing about which way should we go and trying to dominate, or even refusing to compromise. Maybe they go into a flight state. I need to get away. I got to try to run away or return to the cars. We can't keep going. We've got to over plan or physically move, even moving away from the group. Maybe they don't know what to do. Maybe they feel stuck, overwhelmed. They go quiet, they sit down, they appear numb or even distant. Maybe they go into a fawn state. I have to make everybody happy and avoid the conflict. So they start agreeing with everybody, trying to keep the peace and downplaying the dangers or the potential risk, and ignoring their own ideas or their own intuition about what to do or about what comes next. So before we go further, I want you to just show you in 60 seconds what these types of situations and unclear expectations in particular can feel like. So you don't have to move, just sit back and just notice. Close your eyes if you want and just imagine your boss or a key client calls you into their office. They look serious and they say, "Hey, I really need you to handle that thing we talked about and make sure it's done the right way, and I need it by Friday." That's it. No other details, no context, no written follow-up, no clarification. I really need you to handle this thing we talked about. Make sure it's done the right way, and I need it by Friday. And I want you just to notice what's happening in your body. Is your heart beating faster? Are your shoulders or your jaw tight? Is your mind racing? Are you trying to figure out what the thing is? Are you already trying to figure out what the next step is? It only takes a few seconds of uncertainty for our nervous systems to activate. Our brain shifts into this threat detection mode because it can't predict what's expected. And so that spike, that tension moves the body into these different types of survival responses. So, depending upon your wiring and your past experiences, you might have reacted differently. You might have gone into a flight response. You might have felt a surge of irritation or frustration, thought, "How am I supposed to know what they mean?" Maybe felt some defensiveness, confrontation, wanted to argue or resist the assignment. Maybe you went into a flight mode. You might immediately just want to get out of the situation, thinking to yourself, maybe if I just avoid it, it'll go away. Maybe you procrastinate, avoid, or distract yourself from it. Maybe you go into a freeze response. You feel paralyzed, unsure what to do next. I have no idea what they mean. I don't know what to ask. You're staring without even starting. You're not sure. You feel stuck. Or maybe you go into a fawn response. You're trying to please or appease. You say, "Sure, no problem. I'll figure it out. I can't let them down." You start over promising and taking on extra work, even though you know it may lead to burnout. Now, imagine if you're living in that state every day under unclear or constantly shifting expectations, which is the state in which most of us are currently living. And it's really no surprise that people disengage, shut down, or react defensively. Our brains and bodies are just not wired or designed to thrive in uncertainty without support, clarity, and regulation. When people are in these survival modes, our brains literally can't process the expectations normally. We lose access to our perspective taking, our future thinking, our prioritization, our emotional self regulation, how we're going to collaborate, how we can adapt or be flexible, and what the plan is. What is the action plan? What are the actual steps that we're going to take? So even a simple expectation can suddenly feel very threatening or confusing because the brain interprets it as just one more demand that I can't handle or I don't have the capacity to handle. So imagine in that survival state of the changing terrain, what happens in our brain is that our actual view narrows. So instead of seeing everything, you can imagine if you're out running a predator, you don't really care about the view. So our actual vision and our view of the situation narrows. We get what you might consider tunnel vision. And in that narrowed view, we tend to focus a lot on the details. We reduce the number of options that we have. We start thinking in a black and white way. We can get confused or even shut down when we really need clarity the most. And so our head is really in a suboptimal state. It doesn't have the creativity that it needs to really look at all the possibilities and find the solution. Similarly, our heart then struggles with connecting and compassion. So when these environments become unstable, like in our world, shifting economies, changing leadership, volatile industries, our first instinct is actually to pull inward, to pull away from other people. We go retreat behind our screens, we focus narrowly on protecting ourselves, and our view of the world and the possibilities actually shrinks. And so we, instead of feeling connected to others, we feel emotionally reactive. We operate from a place of fear and resentment that actually replace the need or replace our connection and our collaboration. We tend to withdraw and disconnect, and we struggle to identify and select what is truly important in these situations. And then our gut will actually suppress our courageous action. So our ability to get into mobilization, to move into action, gets impeded. If we mobilize, it's to be defensive. It's to preserve ourselves instead of collaborate together to find a collective commitment on how to move forward. So we shut down and we act based on fear rather than based on the wisest next step. And so in these survival states, when this is happening, our perception is narrowing, our emotional trust is eroding, and our action taking is fragmented. And in these states, each of our head, heart, and gut become dysregulated, and each of them then is not operating in their best state. The head brain becomes a fear-focused analyzer, not a creative thinker. The heart moves from connection to protection, shutting down empathy and relational trust. And the gut shifts from wise action to raw survival reaction. So instead of seeing expectations or planning or figuring out what we're going to do next as shared agreements that can guide us toward success, we begin interpreting them as threats, burdens, or tests of survival. And no amount of clarity is going to overcome the system that is stuck in survival. People are not seeing clearly. Communication begins to break down. Trust fractures. Good ideas are lost. Poor decisions get made because choices are made by fear, not wisdom. And in organizations, this can even look like overwhelm, breakdown of communication, isolation, siloing, misalignment, missed goals, erosion of creativity, courage, and compassion. And the longer that we're stuck in this state, the harder it is to align, problem solve, and move together towards the best possible solution. Now, it's important to note that our ways of being that we talked about earlier, those ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving, impact how we interpret our experience and our capacity for what we can do within that experience, what we see, hear, think, feel, and do. Our brains are actually wired in such a way that we don't passively receive information. Our brains are actively predicting what's going to happen next based on all those past patterns, those ways of being. And as a result, we interpret those situations through that lens. So when people are dysregulated, whether they're in that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn state, expectations stop being clear and they start being interpreted as threats, burdens, or tests of survival. And when survival mode kicks in, no amount of clarity is going to land because the brain isn't wired for collaboration when it's focused on protection. When our brain is in how am I going to survive, it is not interested in how we work together to accomplish or get to the best possible outcome. And so we have to think about that this is the lens through which we're interpreting everything that we're experiencing, and it's going to cloud, it's going to impact what we see. So just because the words are clear doesn't mean it's going to cut through all of the noise of a person's past patterns. And so that means we have to pay extra attention to how we create clarity when people are in this survival state or when they're in these types of situations. So what happens is survival mode really demands a grounded clarity. So when people are overwhelmed, normal clarity isn't going to be enough. We have to have grounded clarity. So what does that mean? We have to communicate those expectations in a way that feels safe. So first, we have to pace it slower. It can't be rapid fire piling on. I need you to do this and this and this and this. We have to go slowly so that their brains can comprehend and that it doesn't trigger that survival instinct. We also have to have a co-regulated tone. We as the leader and as we work together as partners need to be in a calm, open, and collaborative state. If we're heightened, we need to regulate before we get into the expectation conversation. We need to provide reassurance that the support and resources are going to be available. We also can check in for shared understanding. Can you tell me what you're hearing so far? This can help to ensure that there's alignment around what's being communicated. This one's really important. We can put it into writing. What gets communicated orally is not always as clear as when we write it down. When we have something to look at and reference, it helps to ensure that we're both seeing and interpreting things the same way. And then finally, we can follow up intentionally. We don't assume that one conversation is going to be sufficient. We recognize that we will have to follow up to provide more clarity, more connection, and ensure that we understand how are people feeling about it? What progress have they made? How are we moving towards it? These are the things that are going to really help to create the grounded clarity. What we know is that successful expectations aren't just clear. There's three things that are really important to having successful expectations. The first is that we're co-regulated with connection, that people's systems feel safe enough to receive, discuss, and meet the expectations. So this means that it's really important that we build up those relationships. So even though when we're in survival, our tendency is to push away, what we actually want to do is create connections and create safety so that we can receive and discuss and act on the expectations. The next is to co-create that clarity. So it needs to be a partnership. It needs to be that both people or the whole group of people is aligned around why it is these expectations matter. Why is it that we're doing this? So it's clear not just what to do, but why it's important to do it. And then finally, wise mobilization, getting into action requires that we reality check capacity. We need to match the expectations to what people currently have the capacity to do. When we try to move forward with idealized versions, like, oh, if you could do all this, it would be amazing, it can lead to shutting people down. So we want to match what we're asking people to do or what we're agreeing to do with what we actually have capacity to accomplish. So let's contrast this to that narrowed view when we're more connected, when we're connected to each other, when we come together and we offer each other compassion for the challenging experience, for all of the things that are creating those survival states. It deflates the stress and it creates a sense of feeling seen, heard, and valued so that we can actually create the alignment and come up with a plan. We're more likely to then take action because we're going to be mobilized because we're not overwhelmed with all the possibilities. So in this state, our head is actually creative and innovative. We see more things. We can see the big picture. We understand the challenge and we can align on what the expectations are. We're asking curious questions rather than being argumentative or trying to take control. From a heart space, we're more compassionate, we're connected with each other, we're building trust, we're recognizing different people's experiences, and we're basing our decisions on our values. What's truly important around our next steps. So grounding ourselves in that compassion and those shared experiences. And then we're relying on our gut to courageously take action. Our gut is in that courageous state where we can define what is that clear path and feel empowered and motivated to move forward towards it. We're also more likely to balance the urgency of the impending threat. There's still a storm on the way, right? In our example, with the wisdom to be resilient of how do we navigate this in the best way possible? How do we get through this situation? And when we do this, the organizations that foster this type of connection, coherence, creativity, compassion, and courage, they thrive even in the crisis. Those that collapse because they're in scarcity, struggle, and self-preservation will tend to fracture. In survival, we argue over the broken paths. In coherence, we create a new one. We figure out what is that new path. And so we're really benefit when we expand into that wider perspective, when we get into that coherent state and we can connect with everybody and we can take in everybody's perspectives and experiences to help us identify the wisest and best path forward for, in whatever the challenging situation is. When we get to this state, after we've regulated ourselves and our teams and we've helped people move out of stress and in coherence, then we still have to go into how do we create really great expectations? How do we create exceptional expectations that people can deliver on? And so we look at these as like our map. And there's kind of three core components for expectations. The first is success targets. This is our head intelligence. What does success look like? What is the clarity that we need on where we're going and how we're going to get there? The second is creating connection. Why is this important and who are we impacting? And then the third is the plan of action. What are we actually doing? How are we doing it? Who's doing what so that we can get there together successfully? And so when our head, heart, and gut, when our intelligences and neural networks are operating at their best, when they're creative, compassionate, and courageous, expectations are understood by our head, expectations are valued from our hearts, and expectations are acted upon by our guts. And so these three elements, the head, heart, and gut, and these three success targets, creating connection, and the plan of action are what are going to actually get you to creating the results you want in your organization, your business, your relationships, your teams by successfully learning how and applying these to expectation setting. So if you want to go further with this, and if you're interested in learning more about each of those three elements and how do you do this in a really effective way, I encourage you to join our performance partner community and participate in our expectation workshop. So every month we do these live webinars and we also do workshops that go along with them that allow you to actually use the different techniques and skills and practice them and experience them and go much deeper into the actual application of expectation setting. In the world today, people are more fragmented, are pulling away from one another because they're dysregulated, because we're in survival states, because there's a lot going on that is scary or threatening or challenging to our experiences and to our lives. And actually, that doesn't help us. It helps more to come together, to connect with other people, to learn about what other people are doing and experiencing. We identify solutions we wouldn't have otherwise thought of. We learn in social learning settings far better than we do on our own. And we are able to navigate these challenging, changing circumstances and survival states much more effectively when we come together, when we create this connection. And in a lot of organizations today, that connection or that safety doesn't exist. There aren't containers where you can really show up in a dysregulated state and connect with others and gain insights and support and co-regulation from the space. And so that's what we've created with this community that offers these workshops. We also have group coaching sessions. We have the ability to message us one-on-one sessions every quarter, and a library of resources that can help you around your own performance and around what you're trying to accomplish. The last thing I want to offer is we have a free resource library that's available to everyone, and we have this wise expectation setting with a collective intelligence. We have this guide for how to do this, to ask yourself questions so that you can set expectations in a really creative, compassionate, and courageous way. Most people think that expectation problems are about clarity, but we know now from this webinar that it's much more about capacity, communication, safety, and constant co-creation. It's not just did we say it clearly, it's can they receive it, believe it, and act on it in the current environment. And what's important about this is it doesn't mean that the situations aren't hard. It doesn't mean that we're not still navigating a challenging world and crisis situations, but it means that you're stable enough inside that challenge to navigate the hard with clarity, creativity, compassion, and courage. So if you want access to this guide, I encourage you to go scan this QR code or go to our website. You can subscribe on our website, and everybody who subscribes gets access to our free resource library with multiple guides. This webinar will be recorded and placed there as well, so that you can access these resources. We just want to make them available to you. As I kind of conclude, exceptional expectations aren't about setting higher bars. They're really about creating deeper alignment. And that's within ourselves, among our teams, and across our organizations. In a world that's really filled with a lot of chaos, the leaders and teams who learn how to regulate, connect, and realign are going to be the ones who not only survive, but truly thrive. So I encourage you, come check us out, come check out these resources, and make sure to join us for next month webinar that's going to probably be on the topic of feedback. So once we've got clarity around expectations, how do we give really effective feedback on it? I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I appreciate you joining us for this time to learn a little bit more about expectations.